Before we begin this journey, I want to warn you that some stories need to be told, even when they break our hearts. What you're about to hear is the remarkable tale of survival against impossible odds, a testimony to the human spirit's capacity to endure darkness and still find light. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps me so much. And take a moment to comment where you're watching this life story from. My name is Elellanar May Johnson, though everyone calls me Miss Ellie now. I'm 83 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm ready to share the story that shaped me. When people see a sweet old lady with silver hair and gentle hands, they don't imagine the battles I've fought. But truth be told, every wrinkle on my face has earned its place. It was 1947 when my world shattered for the first time. I was just 7 years old, living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. We weren't rich by any means, but Mama made sure our home was filled with love. She had a way of turning the simplest things into magic. An old flour sack became a beautiful dress with her skilled hands, and leftover cornmeal transformed into the most delicious bread you ever tasted. Mama worked as a housemaid for a wealthy white family across town. Each morning before dawn, she'd press her only good dress, pin her hair carefully under her scarf, and kiss my forehead goodbye. "Be good for your daddy, songbird," she'd whisper, her breath warm against my cheek. "I'll be home before the stars come out." That particular summer day started like any other. The cicadas were singing their endless song, and the air hung heavy with humidity. I was playing with a rag doll Mama had made me when Mrs. Peterson from next door came running up our dirt path, her face streaked with tears. I remember how time seemed to slow as she knelt before me, her hands trembling as they gripped my shoulders. "Child," she said, her voice breaking. "There's been an accident at the Montgomery house where your mama works." The details came later, in hushed whispers not meant for a child's ears. Mama had fallen down the grand staircase while polishing the banister, or at least that's what the Montgomery family claimed. Years later, I would learn from another maid who was there that day that Mrs. Montgomery had pushed her in a fit of rage over a broken teacup, a priceless family heirloom, they said, as if any object could be worth a human life. The funeral was held 3 days later. I wore the blue Sunday dress Mama had finished sewing just the week before. It was too big. She'd made it for me to grow into, a future she wouldn't be part of. The church was packed with people from our community, their faces solemn as the preacher spoke of heaven and God's mysterious ways. I didn't understand much of what he said. I was too focused on the simple wooden coffin at the front of the church, trying to comprehend how my mama, so full of life and love, could be lying still inside it. Daddy stood beside me, his face a stone mask. He didn't cry, not at the church, not at the burial, not even when we returned to our empty house. That night, after our neighbors had left with their covered dishes and condolences, he sat at our kitchen table and pulled out a bottle of whiskey I'd never seen before. "Go to bed, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and cold in a way I didn't recognize. "Crying won't bring her back. You're the woman of the house now." I was 7 years old, suddenly tasked with filling the enormous void my mother left behind. By 8, I was cooking meals, though I had to stand on a chair to reach the stove. By 9, I was doing laundry, my small hands raw from scrubbing clothes against the washboard. School became a luxury rather than a right. I would go when the housework was done, which meant I missed more days than I attended. The neighbors tried to help when they could. Miss Josephine would invite me over to help with her baking, though I knew she was really making sure I got at least one proper meal that day. Mr. and Mrs. Washington would leave extra vegetables from their garden on our porch. And Miss Ellie, the kind woman I would later name myself after, would slip me pieces of sweet potato pie and books to read by candlelight after Daddy had passed out from drinking. "Your mama would be so proud of how strong you are, child," she'd whisper, smoothing my unruly hair with gentle hands. "But she'd want you to keep that smart mind of yours growing too." It was Miss Ellie who spoke to my teacher, Mrs. Johnson, about my situation. After that, Mrs. Johnson began sending homework home with the Washington children for me. On rare Sundays when Daddy would go fishing with some men from the lumber yard where he worked, I'd sneak over to Mrs. Johnson's house for impromptu lessons. "You've got your mama's quick mind," she told me once, after I'd solved all the arithmetic problems she'd given me. "Don't you let anyone dim that light." Those words became my secret strength, a talisman I held close through the darkest nights when Daddy's drinking turned him mean. He never hit me in those early years. The violence was in his words, in the way he'd compare me unfavorably to Mama, in how he'd mock my attempts to keep our home together. "Can't even fry an egg right," he'd mutter, pushing away the plate I'd prepared. "Your mama could cook a feast with nothing but scraps." Each criticism cut deep, but I learned to hide my tears until I was alone. At night, I'd often slip outside to sit on our porch steps, looking up at the stars and talking to Mama. I'd tell her about my day, about the things I was learning from Mrs. Johnson's books, and how I tried to keep her memory alive by humming the spirituals she used to sing while hanging laundry. "I miss you something awful, Mama," I'd whisper to the night sky, "but I'm trying to be strong like you taught me." On those quiet nights, with crickets chirping and distant train whistles breaking the silence, I could almost feel her presence, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. Those moments of peace would sustain me through another day of growing up too fast in a world that seemed determined to break me. The first time Daddy raised his hand to me, I was 11 years old. I'd burned the cornbread, the only food we had left in the house until payday. His palm connected with my cheek with such force that I stumbled backward against the stove, the hot surface searing through my thin cotton dress and into the skin of my lower back. The pain was immediate and blinding, but it was the look in his eyes that terrified me most. There was no remorse, no shock at what he'd done. Only a cold emptiness that told me a boundary had been crossed and there was no going back. From that day forward, life in our little house became a dangerous dance of trying to anticipate Daddy's moods, to make myself invisible when the whiskey bottle came out, and to endure the punishments that came when I couldn't disappear fast enough. Most nights, I'd wait until his snores filled the house before tending to my injuries, cooling burns with precious well water, pressing damp cloths to bruises, biting down on a folded rag to muffle my cries when the pain was too much to bear silently. In the morning, I'd cover any visible marks with long sleeves or high collars, regardless of the Alabama heat. Our neighbors suspected what was happening behind our closed doors. I could see it in their pitying glances, in the way conversations would stop when I approached. But in our community in the 1950s South, family business stayed family business. The authorities wouldn't intervene for a colored child being disciplined by her father, not when they turned a blind eye to far worse injustices every day. By 1953, as I approached my 13th birthday, the world outside our little house was changing. Brown v. Board of Education had just been decided by the Supreme Court, though it would be years before any real integration happened in Alabama. I would listen to the radio reports about the decision, about the resistance to it, about a young minister named King who was beginning to speak about dignity and justice in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. One evening, as I was listening to one of these reports while preparing dinner, Daddy came home earlier than expected. He yanked the radio cord from the wall, his face contorted with rage. "Filling your head with dangerous ideas," he growled. "That's what got your mama killed, thinking she was equal to white folks." It was the first time he'd ever suggested Mama's death wasn't an accident, and the implication hit me like a physical blow. That night, as I lay on my thin mattress nursing fresh bruises, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way out, not just for my safety, but to honor Mama's memory in a way that hiding and surviving couldn't. I didn't know then how that escape would come, or that it would arrive in the form of a movement that would change not just my life, but the course of history itself. All I knew was that somewhere beyond the confines of our small house and the limitations of being a young black girl in the Jim Crow South, there had to be more than this. There had to be the possibility of freedom, not just from Daddy's fists, but from a system designed to keep people like me small and afraid. Looking back now, as an old woman who has lived to see changes I couldn't have imagined in those dark days, I recognize that this was the moment when a seed of resistance took root in my heart. It would be years before that seed would fully bloom, but in that moment of clarity amid my pain, something fundamental shifted. I was no longer just surviving until I could escape. I was beginning to envision a different world worth fighting for. And fight I would, though the battles ahead would test every ounce of strength and courage I possessed. As 1960 dawned, I had survived 6 years under my father's increasingly tyrannical rule. By then, Birmingham was a city on edge. The early tremors of what would become the civil rights movement were already being felt, though few predicted the earthquakes to come. For a black girl of 16 living in the shadow of violence, these changes seemed both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. The day I turned 16, Daddy didn't acknowledge my birthday. It wasn't a surprise. He hadn't marked the occasion since Mama died. But this particular morning, he did something unexpected. He tossed a crumpled newspaper across our worn kitchen table as I served his breakfast. "Job listing," he grunted, gesturing at the circled advertisement. "Maid position with the Williams family. You start Monday." My heart sank as I read the details. The Williams family lived on Mountain Brook, the wealthiest white neighborhood in Birmingham, nearly 2 hours away by bus. Working there would mean the end of any hope I had of returning to school. "But Daddy," I began hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson said, if I can finish this year, I might qualify for—" The back of his hand connected with my mouth before I could finish. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as he leaned in close. Whiskey fumes heavy on his breath, even at 7 in the morning. "You think you're better than your mama? Too good to clean white folks' houses?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Education won't save you from what you are. Best you learn that now." I started work the following Monday. The Williams house was an imposing 2-story colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens, a world away from our decaying neighborhood. Mrs. Williams was a thin woman with perpetually pursed lips who inspected my work with a white-gloved finger, pointing out dust I couldn't even see. Mr. Williams was rarely home, but when he was, I learned to make myself scarce. There was something in the way his eyes followed me that made my skin crawl. The family had 2 children, a girl about my age named Catherine, who never acknowledged my existence, and a boy named James, 12 years old and already practicing the casual cruelty he'd observed in the adults around him. He would deliberately spill things after I'd cleaned or hide items and claim I'd stolen them. My days began at 4:30 a.m. to catch the first bus and ended well after dark. The pay was pitiful, most of which Daddy took for room and board. But the job came with one unexpected blessing. Mrs. Williams insisted I take home their leftovers rather than waste good food on garbage. Those scraps often constituted the only decent meals I had all week. One evening in early 1961, I returned home to find Daddy sitting with a man I'd never seen before. Mr. Clayton, a foreman at the steel mill and nearly 30 years my senior. As I entered, they fell silent, eyeing me in a way that made me instinctively back toward the door. "There she is," Daddy said, his words slightly slurred. "Ain't she something? Looks just like her mama at that age." Mr. Clayton nodded approvingly, his gaze traveling over me in a way that made me want to disappear into the floorboards. "She'll make a good wife," he agreed, as if I weren't standing right there. Strong back for work and childbearing. The realization of what was happening hit me like a bucket of ice water. Daddy was trying to marry me off, to a man older than himself. Later, I would learn that Mr. Clayton had offered to forgive a substantial gambling debt in exchange for my hand. I was being traded like livestock to settle my father's accounts. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, thinking of Mama and wondering what she would do. For the first time, I seriously considered running away, though the stories of what happened to young black girls on their own were enough to make my blood run cold. Where would I go? How would I survive? The questions swirled in my mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. The following Sunday, desperate for any guidance, I lingered after church service to speak with Reverend Jackson. He was a kind man who had presided over Mama's funeral, and one of the few people Daddy still showed a modicum of respect toward. I confided my situation in hurried whispers, aware that several church ladies were watching with curious eyes. Reverend Jackson's face grew grave as he listened. When I finished, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "The Lord doesn't intend for a child to be sold in marriage," he said firmly. "Leave this with me, Elellanar. Come to the parsonage tomorrow afternoon." The next day, I slipped away from the Williams house during my lunch break, heart pounding with fear of being discovered. Mrs. Jackson ushered me into their modest home, where I found Reverend Jackson sitting with a middle-aged couple I recognized vaguely from church, the Hendersons. "Eleanor," Reverend Jackson began, "the Hendersons' daughter has moved to Detroit for work. They have a room to spare and are willing to take you in as a boarder. Mrs. Henderson needs help with her seamstress business, which would provide you with decent employment." Hope flared in my chest, bright and painful. "But, Daddy," I started. "Leave your father to me," he interrupted gently. "There are ways to handle this that protect everyone involved." What followed was a delicate negotiation conducted entirely without my presence. I was told only that Reverend Jackson had convinced my father that my marriage to Mr. Clayton would bring shame upon our family in the eyes of the church community. Instead, he proposed that I would bring more value as a working boarder with the Hendersons, with a portion of my wages still going to my father. Given the choice between social ostracism and a continued income stream, Daddy reluctantly agreed. 2 days later, I moved my meager belongings, 3 dresses, a pair of worn shoes, Mama's Bible, and a faded photograph of her, into the Hendersons' spare room. The space was small but clean, with a real bed, not just a mattress on the floor, and a window that overlooked Mrs. Henderson's carefully tended vegetable garden. After years of walking on eggshells, the peace of that room felt almost disorienting. Mrs. Henderson was strict but fair. Under her tutelage, I learned the fine art of dressmaking, how to take accurate measurements, cut patterns, and create garments that flattered various body types. My fingers, already nimble from years of necessary mending, quickly adapted to the precise requirements of her business. Soon, I was not just assisting but creating dresses of my own design, which became popular among the young women in our community. "You have a gift, child," Mrs. Henderson remarked one evening as we finished a wedding dress for the daughter of a local deacon. "Your mama must have taught you well." I swallowed the lump that formed in my throat. She taught me the basics before, but mostly I just remember watching her hands work magic with needle and thread. For the first time in years, I began to feel something like peace. Though I still sent money home to Daddy each week, delivered by Mr. Henderson to avoid any direct contact, I was effectively free of his daily torments. The Hendersons treated me with a respectful kindness that felt foreign after so many years of abuse. They insisted I attend church regularly and encouraged me to join the youth choir, where my voice, unused for so long except for necessary communication, rediscovered the hymns Mama had taught me. It was in this choir that I met Samuel Davis, a tall young man with serious eyes and a quiet dignity that set him apart from other boys our age. His father was a Pullman porter on the railroad, a prestigious position that allowed their family slightly more comfort than most in our community. Samuel was one of the few young men our age who hadn't already left for factory work in the North, having secured an apprenticeship with a local carpenter. "You have a beautiful voice," he told me shyly after practice one evening. "Like angels whispering." I blushed at the compliment, unaccustomed to kind words from anyone, much less a handsome young man. Over the following months, a cautious friendship blossomed between us. Samuel would walk me home from choir practice, careful to keep a respectable distance under Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. We'd talk about music, about his work, about dreams that seemed impossible yet worth holding on to. "My daddy says there's going to be changes coming," Samuel confided one evening as we sat on the Hendersons' front porch swing. "Says this Dr. King fellow is waking people up, making them see what's been happening right under their noses all along." I nodded, thinking of the radio reports I'd heard, the whispered conversations among adults that would cease when children entered the room. "Do you really think things could be different?" I asked, trying to keep the desperate hope from my voice. Samuel's expression grew solemn. "They have to be. Men can't keep other men or women in chains forever without something breaking." By late 1962, rumors of organized protests were sweeping through Birmingham's black communities. Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth were planning something big, people whispered. Something that would force the nation to see the brutal reality of segregation in the most violently divided city in America. The Hendersons were cautiously supportive of the movement, but worried about the potential for violence. Mr. Henderson had seen firsthand the brutality of Bull Connor's police force and feared for the safety of anyone who dared to challenge the established order. "Sometimes standing up is the only choice left," Samuel argued during Sunday dinner at the Hendersons' table, where he had become a regular guest. "If we keep waiting for the right time, our grandchildren will still be drinking from colored water fountains." Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue disapprovingly, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. "They're standing up. The Lord calls for wisdom alongside courage." I listened to these debates with increasing interest, the seed of resistance that had taken root years ago now growing stronger. Though I rarely contributed to these discussions, preferring to observe and absorb, my mind was alive with questions and possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. My relative peace was shattered in February 1963, when Mr. Henderson arrived home, ashen-faced from delivering my weekly payment to Daddy. "Your father's sick, Eleanor," he said quietly. "The doctor says it's his liver. He's asking for you." A tangle of emotions knotted in my stomach: fear, residual anger, and an unexpected thread of pity. Despite everything he'd done, everything he'd failed to be, he was still the man who had once swung me high on his shoulders and called me his songbird, before hatred and grief had consumed him. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling in long strips like dead skin. Inside, the smell hit me immediately. Illness and neglect, unwashed sheets and stale whiskey. Daddy lay on the same bed he'd shared with Mama, his once powerful frame wasted to almost nothing. His skin had a yellowish tint, and his eyes, when they focused on me, showed a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Eleanor," he croaked, his voice a dry rustle. "You came." I nodded, standing awkwardly in the doorway, unsure how to proceed. Part of me wanted to turn and run. Another part felt rooted to the spot by obligation or curiosity. I couldn't tell which. "Sit," he said, gesturing weakly to the edge of the bed. When I hesitated, something like shame crossed his face. "Please, I won't hurt you. Those days are done." Cautiously, I perched on the very edge of the mattress, ready to spring away if needed. Up close, I could see how death had already begun to claim him, hollowing his cheeks and sinking his eyes. "I ain't been right since your mama died," he said after a long silence. "Took the best of me with her. That's no excuse for what I'd done to you." He paused, each breath visibly paining him. "I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know. I see what I did. Too late, but I see it." Tears pricked at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. This deathbed confession couldn't erase years of pain, couldn't heal the scars both visible and invisible that I would carry forever. But in that moment, I saw not the monster of my nightmares, but a broken man who had lost his way in grief. "I forgive you," I heard myself say, the words emerging before I'd consciously formed them. "Not for you, for me, so I don't have to carry your sins alongside my scars." He nodded once, a tear slipping down his sunken cheek. "You got her strength, her heart, best parts of both of us." We sat in silence after that, the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between us. Eventually, his breathing grew more labored, and I called for the doctor waiting in the next room. Daddy died 3 days later, with me reading from Mama's Bible at his bedside. The funeral was sparsely attended, a testament to how thoroughly he had isolated himself from the community that might have helped him heal. As we left the cemetery, Samuel took my hand in his, a public gesture that would have been unthinkable just months before. "You're free now," he said quietly. I looked back at the fresh grave beside my mother's older one. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. And it's time I figured out what that means. Little did I know that the path to true freedom would lead me into the heart of a movement that was about to shake Birmingham and the nation to its very foundations. The spring of 1963 was approaching, and with it, a baptism by fire that would transform me from a survivor to a fighter. April 1963 arrived with an electricity in the air that seemed to vibrate through Birmingham's streets. The whispers had grown louder, meetings more frequent, and even those who had previously kept their distance from troublemaking began to listen with intent when news of Dr. King's plans spread through our community. After Daddy's funeral, I had moved permanently into the Hendersons' home, no longer as a boarder, but as something closer to family. Mrs. Henderson had formally taken me on as an apprentice in her dressmaking business, and my designs had developed a modest following among the younger women in our church. "You have a future in this, Eleanor," she often told me, "a way to support yourself with dignity." But while I appreciated her encouragement, something had awakened in me that couldn't be satisfied by needle and thread alone. The movement was calling, its pull as irresistible as a tide. One evening in early April, Samuel arrived at the Hendersons' door with unusual urgency. After dinner, as we sat on the porch swing, now with Mrs. Henderson's blessing, though she still monitored us through the window, he leaned in close. "There's a meeting tonight at 16th Street Baptist," he whispered. "Dr. King himself will be speaking. They're planning demonstrations. Big ones. Will you come with me?" Mrs. Henderson would never approve of me attending such a gathering. Though sympathetic to the cause, she feared the violence that would inevitably follow. I glanced back at the window where her silhouette was visible through the curtains. "Tell her we're going for a walk to discuss wedding plans," Samuel suggested with a mischievous smile that made my heart flutter despite the seriousness of the moment. It wasn't entirely a lie. Though no formal proposal had been made, we had begun to speak of a future together, a modest home, perhaps children someday. Mrs. Henderson, eager to see me settled respectably, had encouraged the courtship, unaware that Samuel's involvement in the movement ran far deeper than occasional dinner-table discussions. The church was packed beyond capacity when we arrived, the air thick with anticipation and the mingled sense of pomade, perfume, and perspiration. We squeezed into a spot near the back, just as Reverend Shuttlesworth rose to introduce Dr. King. I had seen photographs in newspapers, heard his voice on radio broadcasts, but nothing prepared me for the physical presence of the man himself. He wasn't tall or imposing in stature, but when he spoke, his voice seemed to reach directly into the core of my being, resonating with truths I had always known, but never heard articulated so powerfully. "We've come to Birmingham because injustice is here," he declared, his words rolling through the church like thunder. "We are here to remind America of the fierce urgency of now." As he outlined the planned campaign of nonviolent direct action, boycotts of downtown businesses, sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, and mass marches that would almost certainly result in arrests, I felt a surge of both terror and exhilaration. This was dangerous, potentially deadly work. Bull Connor's reputation for brutality was well earned, his officers and fire department notorious for their enthusiasm in suppressing even the most peaceful black gatherings. Yet sitting in that church, surrounded by people who had decided that dignity was worth risking everything for, I understood with sudden clarity that this was what Mama would have wanted for me. Not just survival, but the courage to stand for something larger than myself. After the speech, volunteers were called forward to receive training in nonviolent resistance techniques. Without conscious decision, I found myself rising from my seat, Samuel's hand clasped tightly in mine. "Eleanor," he whispered, surprise evident in his voice. "Are you sure?" I nodded, unable to articulate the certainty I felt. This was right. This was necessary. This was perhaps what I had been preserved through years of hardship to do. The training sessions were held in church basements and private homes over the following days. We learned how to protect our vital organs when being beaten, how to maintain dignity while being arrested, how to respond to hatred with determined love rather than retaliatory anger. We role-played scenarios, taking turns playing demonstrators and police, practicing how to go limp rather than resist arrest, how to shield our heads from billy clubs. Mrs. Henderson discovered my involvement after the first weekend of demonstrations began on April 6th. A neighbor had seen me among the protesters at a department store sit-in and reported back with concerned disapproval. "Have you lost your mind, child?" she demanded when I returned home. "Do you have any idea what those policemen will do to you? What they do to our girls especially?" I met her gaze steadily, finding a courage I hadn't known I possessed. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I do. But someone has to stand. If not me, then who?" Her eyes filled with tears as she pulled me into a fierce embrace. "Your mama would be proud," she whispered, "and terrified, just like I am." From that day forward, the Hendersons' home became a quiet hub of support for the movement. Henderson used his delivery truck to transport protesters to and from demonstration sites, careful to vary his routes to avoid police surveillance. The true test came on May 2nd when the youth marches began. Dr. King and his advisors had made the controversial decision to include children and teenagers in the demonstrations, knowing the national outrage that would follow if young people were arrested and jailed. Though I was nearly 19 by then, I joined the youth contingent alongside Samuel, who had been appointed a group leader because of his calm demeanor under pressure. The morning dawned clear and warm as hundreds of us gathered at 16th Street Baptist, receiving last-minute instructions and encouragement from movement leaders. We sang freedom songs that lifted our spirits and steeled our resolve. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land." As we prepared to exit the church in orderly groups of 50, a young minister I knew as Reverend Abernathy addressed us. "Remember, no matter what happens today, you are fighting for your dignity, for your future, and for generations yet unborn. Walk with pride, meet hatred with love, and know that the eyes of the world are watching." I was assigned to the third group, led by a Howard University student named Diane Nash. Samuel would lead the fifth group, meaning we would be separated during the march. Before joining my group, he pulled me aside, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "If they arrest you," he said quietly, "don't resist. Give them your real name. The lawyers will find you faster that way. If they hurt you," his voice caught, "remember you're not alone. We're all with you, even when they separate us." He pressed something into my palm, a small silver cross on a chain. "My mama's," he explained. "Said it always protected her. Want it to protect you now." I slipped it around my neck, tucking it beneath my blouse where it rested cool against my skin. Standing on tiptoe, I kissed him quickly, not caring who saw. "See you on the other side," I whispered. Our group exited the church singing "We Shall Overcome," moving with deliberate steps toward Kelly Ingram Park. We had barely made it 2 blocks when police vans screeched to a halt in front of us, Bull Connor himself emerging from the lead vehicle, bullhorn in hand. "You Negras disperse immediately," his voice crackled through the amplifier. "You are participating in an unauthorized demonstration in violation of city ordinances." Diane Nash stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "We are exercising our constitutional right to peaceful assembly and protest. We will not disperse." What followed remains burned into my memory with photographic clarity. Officers descended on us with nightsticks and snarling police dogs. Those in front dropped to their knees in prayer, following our training. I found myself doing the same, heart hammering in my chest as an officer approached, his face contorted with disgust. "Last chance," he growled, nightstick tapping against his palm. I looked him directly in the eyes, surprising myself with the steady calm in my voice. "I'm staying right here, sir." The blow caught me across the shoulders, pain exploding through my upper back. I curled forward, protecting my head as we'd been taught, Mama's cross pressing against my breastbone. More officers moved through our group, roughly pulling protesters to their feet, dragging those who went limp as instructed. I was hauled upright by 2 officers who twisted my arms behind my back with unnecessary force. Handcuffs bit into my wrists, the metal cold and unyielding. As they shoved me toward a transport van already crowded with other young protesters, I caught sight of newspaper photographers capturing the scene. For a moment, I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and looked directly into the nearest camera lens. "See me," I thought fiercely. See what they're doing to us for asking to be treated as human beings. The Birmingham jail was overcrowded to the point of inhumanity as hundreds of young protesters were processed and detained. Designed to hold at most 250 inmates, the jail soon contained over 1,000 of us. The cell I was placed in with 15 other young women had been built for 4. We took turns sitting on the single bunk in the floor, developing a rotation system for the minimal comfort it provided. Despite the conditions, or perhaps because of them, a remarkable spirit took hold among the detained protesters. We sang freedom songs nearly constantly, their rhythms and harmonies echoing through the concrete corridors, cell block answering cell block, until the entire jail seemed to vibrate with our collective voice. Guards shouted for silence, pounded batons against cell bars, but the singing would only quiet momentarily before rising again, often from a different section of the jail. On the 3rd day of our detention, a guard appeared at our cell. "Johnson," he barked. "Eleanor Johnson. Visitor." My cellmates helped me to my feet, offering whispered encouragement as I was led down the corridor to a small visitation room divided by a mesh screen. To my surprise, it wasn't the Hendersons or Samuel waiting for me, but Reverend Jackson and a white man in a suit I didn't recognize. "This is Mr. Marshall," Reverend Jackson explained after inquiring about my well-being. "He's a lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's working on getting you released." Mr. Marshall nodded professionally. "Miss Johnson, we're filing habeas corpus petitions for all the juvenile protesters. We believe the city has violated numerous constitutional protections in these arrests." "I'm 19, sir," I corrected quietly. "Not a juvenile." He exchanged glances with Reverend Jackson. "That's actually why we're here specifically. We have reason to believe your photograph may appear in tomorrow's edition of the New York Times. A journalist identified you by name to his editor. Your story, orphaned girl overcoming an abusive childhood to stand for justice, it has narrative power." I blinked, trying to absorb what he was saying. "My picture? In a newspaper in New York? Potentially more than that," Reverend Jackson added gently. "The journalist is requesting an interview when you're released. The movement needs stories that touch hearts, Eleanor. Yours could be one of them." Over the next 2 days, as negotiations between movement leaders and city officials intensified, I was interviewed by not just one, but 3 different reporters who had somehow gained access to the jail. I told them about Mama, about growing up under Daddy's tyranny, about finding my voice and purpose in the movement. I spoke of dignity and determination, carefully following the talking points movement leaders had drilled into us during training. On May 10th, an agreement was reached. The city would begin desegregating public facilities and release the imprisoned demonstrators. As we emerged from the jail to the cheers of supporters, I was startled to find multiple photographers focusing their cameras on me, specifically. A national magazine reporter thrust a microphone toward my face. "Miss Johnson, how does it feel to have become one of the faces of the Birmingham campaign?" she asked. Before I could respond, Samuel appeared at my side, wrapping a protective arm around my shoulders. Despite 6 days in jail himself, he looked remarkably composed. "She's just done 6 days in inhumane conditions for the crime of asking to be treated as a human being," he answered firmly. "She'll be making no further statements today." He guided me through the crowd to where the Hendersons waited with their truck. Mrs. Henderson already fussing over my appearance, and Mr. Henderson gruffly blinking away what looked suspiciously like tears. That evening, as I soaked in a proper bath for the first time in nearly a week, I could hear the murmur of voices from the Hendersons' living room, where Samuel was in deep discussion with Reverend Jackson and several movement organizers who had come to the house specifically to see me. Later, Samuel explained their visit. "They want you to speak at rallies," he said, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "That photograph of you looking directly into the camera while being arrested, it's everywhere. People are calling you the girl with dignity. They think your story can help people understand what we're fighting for." In the weeks that followed, I found myself in an entirely unexpected role, a movement spokesperson. I traveled with more experienced activists to churches and community centers across the South, telling my story and connecting it to the larger struggle for dignity and justice. My natural reserve gradually gave way to a discovered gift for public speaking, my quiet voice finding strength in purpose. By August, when we traveled to Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, I was scheduled to give a brief address from the podium at the Lincoln Memorial, not among the headliners like Dr. King, but as a representative of the youth contingent standing on those steps, looking out at the sea of faces extending all the way to the Washington Monument. I felt Mama's presence more strongly than I had since her death. As I stepped to the microphone, Samuel squeezed my hand once before releasing it. "My name is Elellanar Johnson," I began, my voice carrying across the hushed crowd. 3 months ago, I was a seamstress in Birmingham, Alabama, trying to make myself small enough to avoid notice. Today, I stand before you as living testimony that none of us was born to be invisible. The crowd's response washed over me like a wave, their applause and cheers carrying me through the remainder of my short speech. When I returned to my seat, Dr. King himself leaned over to shake my hand. "Well done, Miss Johnson," he said with a warm smile. "Your mother would be proud." I stared at him in surprise. "You didn't know my mother, Dr. King." His smile deepened. "No, but I know daughters, and no mother could help but be proud of a daughter who carries herself with such dignity." Hours later, after his "I Have a Dream" speech had moved the nation to tears and hope, Samuel and I stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as the crowd gradually dispersed. The marble felt cool beneath my tired feet as I slipped off my shoes, looking out over the reflecting pool now strewn with pamphlets and paper cups, evidence of the multitude that had gathered in peaceful solidarity. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Samuel took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "We keep fighting. The march isn't the end. It's barely the beginning." "I meant for us," I clarified, turning to face him fully. Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability replacing his usual steady confidence. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box that looked incongruously fancy in his calloused carpenter's hand. "I was going to wait for a proper moment," he admitted. "A nice restaurant, maybe, or back home in the garden at sunset. But standing here with Lincoln and history as witnesses," he opened the box, revealing a modest ring with a single small diamond. "Elellanar May Johnson, will you build a future with me? Not just a marriage, but a partnership in this work we've both been called to?" Tears blurred my vision as I nodded, words momentarily beyond my capacity. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I found my voice again. "From this day forward," I promised, "whatever comes, we face it standing." We were married 2 months later at 16th Street Baptist Church, a decision that took on painful significance when, just weeks before our wedding, a bomb planted by Klansmen killed 4 little girls during Sunday school at that very sanctuary. We had considered changing venues after the tragedy, but Reverend Jackson convinced us otherwise. "Those children died because hateful men fear what happens when we claim our rightful place in this society," he said. "We honor them by continuing to claim that place, in life, in love, in joy, even in the midst of grief." And so, on November 16th, 1963, I walked down the aisle of the partially rebuilt church, passing the pew where I had first heard Dr. King speak, to join my life with Samuel's. My borrowed wedding dress was simple but elegant, made with loving care by Mrs. Henderson, who had become the mother my heart needed after losing my own. As we exchanged vows, I felt the presence of all who had brought me to this moment. Mama, whose love had sustained me even after her death. Daddy, whose brokenness had taught me the cost of surrendering to hatred. The Hendersons, who had shown me what family could be. And the movement that had helped me find my voice. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Jackson declared with evident joy. "You may kiss your bride." As Samuel's lips met mine, sealing our commitment before God and community, I knew with bone-deep certainty that this was just one milestone in a journey that would continue for decades to come. The struggle for full equality was far from over, the path ahead still fraught with danger and setbacks. But for the first time in my life, I was fully free, not just from Daddy's fists or society's limitations, but free to become the woman I was always meant to be. And that woman, I had discovered, was stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. The years following our wedding were marked by tremendous change, both in our nation and in my personal journey. We began our married life in a modest one-bedroom apartment not far from the Hendersons, with Samuel continuing his carpentry work while I divided my time between Mrs. Henderson's dressmaking business and increasingly frequent speaking engagements for the movement. The assassination of Dr. Sir King in April 1968 struck us like a physical blow. I had just discovered I was pregnant with our first child when the news reached us. Samuel and I held each other in stunned silence, our tears mingling as the radio delivered details of his murder in Memphis. The following day, riots erupted across the nation, a physical manifestation of collective grief and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of our country. "What kind of world are we bringing this child into?" I whispered that night, my hand resting protectively over my still flat stomach. Samuel placed his hand over mine, his voice steady despite the grief etched in his face. "A broken one," he admitted, "but one worth fighting to repair." 2 days later, despite warnings about potential violence, we joined thousands of mourners in a memorial march through Birmingham. I wore a black armband over my Sunday best, carrying a hand-lettered sign that read simply, "His dream lives in us." The streets were eerily quiet, our footsteps and muffled sobs the only sounds disturbing the heavy silence that had descended over the city. Our daughter was born that September, Marion Liberty Davis, named for both the great contralto Marian Anderson and the freedom we continued to pursue. She arrived with a powerful set of lungs and a determination that reminded me immediately of my mother. "She's going to be a fighter," the midwife chuckled as she placed my screaming daughter in my arms. "She comes by it honestly," Samuel replied, his eyes shining with tears as he stroked her perfect tiny fingers. Motherhood transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The fierce protectiveness I felt toward Marion gave new urgency to our work. Every segregated playground, every underfunded colored school, every lingering vestige of Jim Crow became not just an abstract injustice, but a direct threat to my child's future. At the same time, the physical demands of caring for an infant necessarily changed my involvement in the movement. Rather than traveling for speaking engagements, I began hosting meetings in our home, turning our modest living room into a planning center for voter registration drives and education initiatives. While Samuel attended marches and demonstrations, I focused on the equally vital work of community organizing, creating networks of support for families affected by poverty and discrimination, establishing a clothing cooperative that evolved from Mrs. Henderson's dressmaking business, and developing adult literacy programs for those who had been denied education. When Marion was 18 months old, Mrs. Henderson suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Without hesitation, Samuel and I moved into the Henderson home to help with her care. Mr. Henderson, himself aging and struggling with arthritis, wept with gratitude when we arrived with our belongings. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, embracing us both. "Sent you to us when you needed family, and now you're returning the blessing." Over the next 2 years, our household settled into a new rhythm. I took over the dressmaking business entirely, expanding it to include a small storefront on the main street of our neighborhood. Samuel built custom furniture in a workshop behind the house, his reputation for quality craftsmanship bringing orders from increasingly diverse clientele, including several white families who would never have considered patronizing a black business just a few years earlier. Marion thrived in this multi-generational household, toddling between Grandpa Henderson in his rocking chair and Grandma Henderson in her sickbed, bringing smiles to both with her infectious giggles and emerging personality. Mrs. Henderson, though physically diminished, became my daughter's first teacher, patiently helping her form letters and numbers with weakened hands that still remembered decades of precise stitchwork. In 1970, our family expanded again with the birth of our son, Martin Samuel Davis. While his sister had entered the world with dramatic flair, Martin arrived quietly, his thoughtful gaze seeming to take in everything around him from his earliest days. "He has an old soul," Mrs. Henderson declared, cradling him with her good arm, while Marion pressed close, examining her new brother with intense curiosity. That same year brought another significant change, when I was offered a position as a community liaison for a new federal program aimed at improving healthcare access in underserved areas. The role combined my organizing experience with my growing passion for addressing the health disparities that plagued our community. "They're offering how much?" Samuel asked incredulously when I showed him the salary letter. I nodded, still somewhat stunned myself. "More than you and I make combined right now." It was a remarkable opportunity, but one that would require significant adjustments, and I worried about Mrs. Henderson's care and the dressmaking business I had built. Once again, our community provided solutions. A young woman from church who had recently graduated from high school was eager to learn the dressmaking trade and happy to help with Mrs. Henderson during the day. Mr. Henderson, whose arthritis had improved with treatment, announced he was ready to be more involved in his wife's care. And several neighborhood mothers established an informal childcare cooperative, taking turns watching each other's children so that all could pursue education or employment. Thus began my professional career in community health advocacy, work that would eventually lead me to positions of significant influence I could never have imagined during those dark days in my father's house. Within 3 years, I was directing a regional program covering 5 counties, developing initiatives that addressed not just medical needs, but the social determinants of health that kept our communities vulnerable. In 1972, I was invited to testify before a congressional committee examining racial disparities in healthcare access, a moment of profound significance as I stood in the halls of power that had for so long excluded people who looked like me. "Mrs. Davis," one congressman began, his tone skeptical, "you've suggested that the health problems in your community are the result of systemic issues rather than individual choices. Could you elaborate?" I looked directly at him, thinking of the mothers I'd worked with who had to choose between medicine and food, the children with preventable illnesses who lived in housing infested with rats and mold, the elderly who couldn't access specialists because no bus routes served their neighborhoods. "With respect, Congressman," I replied, "when a system consistently produces the same negative outcomes for a specific group of people across generations, we must examine the system rather than blaming its victims. The mothers I work with don't love their children less than mothers in your district. They simply face barriers your constituents never encounter." My testimony resulted in increased funding for several pilot programs, and more importantly, opened doors for others from my community to be heard in similarly influential spaces. I began to understand that my personal journey from abuse to advocacy had equipped me with a unique ability to translate between worlds, to help those in power understand the realities faced by the marginalized, and to help my community navigate systems designed to exclude them. As my professional responsibilities expanded, Samuel's business likewise grew beyond our expectations. His workshop became a small factory, employing several young men from the neighborhood, many of whom had struggled to find work despite the civil rights gains of the previous decade. He specialized in custom church furnishings, altars, pulpits, and baptismal fonts that graced sanctuaries throughout the South and beyond. "Never thought my hands would create something that would hold God's word," he once mused, running his fingers over the intricate carving of a pulpit destined for a historic church in Atlanta. "My daddy would have been proud to see this." Our children grew in this atmosphere of purpose and possibility, absorbing without fully understanding the significance of the changes occurring around them. Marion inherited my voice and outspoken nature, leading her elementary school in integrating its formerly segregated gifted program through sheer force of will and undeniable academic excellence. Martin, quieter but equally determined, showed remarkable artistic talent, spending hours in his father's workshop learning to coax beauty from raw wood. In 1975, Mrs. Henderson passed peacefully in her sleep, having lived to see her 80th birthday celebrated by 4 generations of both blood relatives and chosen family. At her funeral, I delivered a eulogy that honored not just her individual kindness to a broken girl in need, but the tradition of community care she represented, the unofficial support networks that had sustained Black Americans through centuries of oppression. Mrs. Henderson taught me that family isn't defined by blood alone, I told the packed church. She showed me that sometimes the people God sends to heal us don't share our name or our history. They simply share their hearts when we need it most. After the service, an elderly woman I didn't recognize approached me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You probably don't remember me," she began hesitantly. "I worked with your mama at the Montgomery house. Was there the day she—" My breath caught. In all the years since Mama's death, I had never spoken with anyone who had witnessed her final moments. "I remember you," I said softly, the memory of her face suddenly surfacing from the fog of childhood grief. "You brought me a handkerchief at the funeral. It had little violets embroidered in the corner." She nodded, tears now flowing freely. "Your mama talked about you all the time. Her little songbird, she called you. Said you were going to fly higher than anyone in your family ever had." She clutched my hand between her gnarled fingers. "She was right, child. Lord, was she right?" That night, after the children were asleep, I shared this encounter with Samuel as we sat on the porch swing that had witnessed so many pivotal conversations in our life together. "Do you think she knows?" I asked, looking up at the star-filled sky. "Mama, I mean. Do you think she can see what became of her frightened little girl?" Samuel followed my gaze upward, his arm warm around my shoulders. "I believe she does. And I believe she's been with you every step of the way, in your courage, in your compassion, in the way you mother our children with such fierce love." The following year brought another unexpected turn when I was approached about running for a seat on the city council. Initial discussions had focused on Samuel as a potential candidate, but he had firmly redirected attention to me. "My wife is the one you want," he told the community leaders who had gathered in our living room. "I build things with my hands. She builds communities with her heart and mind." The campaign was grueling, marked by both overt racism and more subtle forms of resistance. Anonymous phone calls threatened violence against our family. Flyers circulated questioning my morality and fitness for office. On one horrible occasion, Marion, now 8 years old, was surrounded by white children at school who parroted their parents' slurs, expressions of support. Volunteers from across the city, including an increasingly visible contingent of white allies, staffed phone banks, distributed literature, and organized neighborhood forums. Local business owners contributed to our modest campaign fund. And most moving of all, elderly community members who had never voted before completed registration paperwork, many signing with X's because they had been denied the education needed to write their names. On election night, surrounded by family and supporters in the fellowship hall of 16th Street Baptist Church, I watched in stunned silence as the results were announced. Elellanar Johnson Davis had become the first Black woman elected to the Birmingham City Council, winning by a margin that defied even our most optimistic projections. "Speech!" the crowd chanted as I stood frozen, Samuel's steadying hand at the small of my back. I approached the microphone slowly, my mind racing back through the improbable journey that had brought me to this moment, from a terrified child hiding from her father's rage to a woman entrusted with shaping policy for the very city that had once denied her basic humanity. "When I was a little girl," I began, "Birmingham taught me painful lessons about who mattered and who didn't in this world. Today, Birmingham has taught me something else, that change, while never easy and rarely swift, is always possible when people of courage stand together." Looking out at the sea of faces before me, black and white, young and old, those who had marched alongside me in 1963 and those not yet born when those marches occurred, I felt the weight of responsibility and the surge of possibility in equal measure. I stand before you tonight as living proof that we are not defined by our wounds, but by our healing. Not limited by our beginnings, but liberated by our capacity to begin again. And most importantly, not isolated in our suffering, but connected in our shared humanity. As applause filled the room, I caught sight of Marion and Martin in the front row, their faces shining with pride and something more profound, the unquestioned belief that they could achieve whatever they set their minds to. For them, a black woman in leadership was not revolutionary, but expected. Their horizons would not be limited by the boundaries that had constrained mine. In that moment, I understood the true arc of my journey from victim to advocate to leader. Each step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to forge the woman I had become. A woman capable of not just surviving adversity, but transforming it into purpose. A woman whose voice, once silenced by fear, now resonated with authority in rooms where decisions affecting thousands were made. The abused child I had been could never have imagined the life I now lived. Yet somewhere deep within that frightened girl had existed the seeds of the strength I now possessed. Seeds nurtured by my mother's brief but powerful love, by the communities that had embraced me, by the movement that had shown me the power of collective action, and by my own stubborn refusal to be defined by my wounds. As the celebration continued around me, I slipped outside for a moment alone. The night air was cool against my skin as I looked up at the same stars I had once confided in as a lonely child. But I was no longer alone, no longer silenced, no longer small. "We did it, Mama," I whispered to the glittering sky. "Your songbird learned to fly." And in the gentle breeze that stirred the trees above me, I could almost hear her answer, "I never doubted you would, child. I never doubted you would." Now, as I sit here at 83, looking back on a life that has spanned council seats and congressional testimonies, community health initiatives and educational foundations, I am most proud not of the accolades or achievements, but of the legacy continued through my children and grandchildren. Marion became a civil rights attorney, fighting modern manifestations of the same injustices I had faced. Martin established arts programs for at-risk youth, healing trauma through creativity, just as I had once found solace in song. And when my grandchildren ask how I found the courage to overcome such a painful beginning, I tell them the truth, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than fear. For me, that something was the determination that the violence that had marked my childhood would not define my future, or theirs. Every wrinkle on my face, every gray hair on my head, every scar visible and invisible that I carry, they all tell the story of a journey from darkness into light, a journey that reminds us all that no matter how broken our beginnings, our endings are still ours to write. And that, my dears, is how a frightened little girl became the woman you know today. Not by forgetting her past, but by refusing to let it dictate her future. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this one. Your support means the world to me. See you next time.